Alrighty, guys. Today we are talking death saves and exhaustion and what I use in my games as a sort of alternative. So I tried out this game called Low Fantasy Gaming, and it's sort of like a sort of old school Renaissance type of ye old D&D. It's been getting like pretty popular relatively recently. Anyway, they've got this stat, like the seventh attribute that they call luck, that they use. I think primarily it comes up as like being used for a death save, even though I don't think they show that example here. And I've sort of tried using this for my sort of like homebrew system that I've been working on. I don't particularly care for like luck as a stat or as a role, which it's like sometimes used for, but that's a whole other topic. And so with the addition of like 1D&D to like the 5e rule set, there's this new rule about every time you go down, you gain a level of exhaustion. And in new D&D, each level of exhaustion just gives you a -1 to all your like d20 rolls. And I'm not particularly a big fan of exhaustion because it just feels so terrible to have. Like I have been playing in a campaign that we've been using these new 1D&D exhaustion rules in, and it just went early in a session. You go down once, you get healed back up, you go down again, then through a status effect or whatever other means, you suffer another exhaustion, and you're up to like a -3, and you just have to go along the rest of this session. And every time you roll that d20, you're subtracting 3, getting rid of all your so hard earned bonuses, and just seeing like time after time, getting a result where you're like, oh, if I just didn't have that -3, I would have just passed. And like as a DM, it's so incredibly easy to see the value in these different fail states and how it can actually be more dramatic to take away someone's tools and like the things that they normally rely upon, force them to use their like cleverness and creativity. And I get that this can kind of be a means to accomplish that, but as a player, I'm just never thinking about that at all. As a player, I'm just thinking about like I want to kill everything in one hit, and I want to be awesome and really cool. And I don't know about like 100% power fantasy, but as like a player, it's like 80% power fantasy, 20% like getting invested in the story. Whereas like a DM, it's like 100% just trying to make the best story you can, at least in my experience. And so I think from the DM's perspective, exhaustion doesn't seem like a bad thing but at all, but just as a player, just feels so bad to have. This is also true of like 5e. When you just have like disadvantage on everything, which is like a -3.75 or something on average, it's just like it feels terrible. And for a long while, so yeah, so this system just entirely replaces like the exhaustion. And there was this problem that I like had for with yo-yo healing, which is this sort of like the way 5e works is when people go down to 0, they like sit around and make death saves for a while, and then you can heal them back up. And there's no negative HP, so you just restore 3 points of health, and now they're back up to 3 health. And then a dragon walks up and smacks them, and they take 65 points of damage. and they go back down to 0, and then you can heal them for 3 points of health, and they can take 65 damage. And I sort of thought that this yo-yo healing was a just a like a negative consequence, like an unintended consequence of how this death saving system worked in 5e. And I guess I wasn't like used to it. I was more so used to like old healing in either old RPGs, old versions of D&D, and or like in video games where like once someone's dead, like healing them doesn't do anything, so you have to heal them before they're dead. And this yo-yo healing I think is actually better than that sort of video game healing, because, well, like, okay, if I use like the example of, playing maybe like medic in TF2 or something, healing people like is obviously a super necessary component of the team, but it's just like it feels not very satisfying, at least compared to any other role where you can be, lining up your mouse on people's heads and left clicking and, blowing up their whole body. And you get that like release of dopamine each time you're getting that kill, your like KD ratio going up. And there's like a tangible event that occurs that like says to you like, hey, you're doing your job right. Like there's like one event that occurs every time you kill someone as that damage dealing character. But as like a medic, you're just constantly taking a pitcher of water and you're filling up a bucket with a hole in it. It's supremely unsatisfying. There's never this like cathartic release. I guess specifically medic, it might have like uber charge or whatever, but like in general in video game medic healer type classes, you're just spinning plates, and you're not even relying upon your skill to like line up headshots and left click. You're just looking in someone's general direction and left clicking. And not to say that there's not like an element of skill involved, obviously, game sense and map knowledge and team coordination and yada yada, all that stuff. But like, I feel like the average like game enjoyer probably does not prefer being that healing guy as opposed to kill guy. And if you were to just directly like get rid of and or like nerf this yo-yo healing, like for a while I had this okay, I guess a problem I think I have with yo-yo healing is that I sort of thought that like it's just the like natural conclusion, like the ultimate conclusion of any combat in D&D is going to be everyone gets reduced to 0 HP, and every time they go down they just get healing worded or lay on hands for 3 HP and they're back in the fight. And I thought this was a problem, so I had tried different forms of like, okay, so once you get healed in combat, you're either stunned for 1d3 rounds or you're stunned for 1 round. I tried like creating like punishments or just ways to nerf like getting healed in mid combat. I now realize that was like very much so not needed. And so yeah, for example, like healing in D&D, if you aren't using this method of yo-yo healing, like healing is just straight up really bad, like 1-to-1 number wise, if we're taking yo-yo healing out of the equation. Like if you use your spell slot to cast a first level cure light wounds, and if you've got like a +3 modifier, you're like on average healing 7.5 health. So that's the only number you're adding on, and conceivably can be used outside of combat. I feel like that minor bonus is like very, very minuscule opposed to the bonuses that, say, for instance, inflict light wounds has. You're dealing on average 16.5 damage whenever it hits. And let's say you only hit 50% of the time, which honestly I think is a little generous. In the defender's favor, I feel like most of the time you're probably even hitting more often than 50% of the time. But even if it is 50% of the time, you're still outpacing the 7.5 healing. And if you kill a goblin, and if on that goblin's next turn, they were going to attack someone and deal on average, I don't know, like 3 damage, then you're also like healing that amount in a sort of technical way. You're like preventing someone from taking that 3 damage that that goblin would have dealt. And you are ultimately moving your entire team towards the win state of the combat, which is generally reduce each enemy to some threshold of damage and or before they reduce you to some amount of hit points. Kind of like in Magic the Gathering, if you cast 7 healing salves or whatever the heal 3 gain 3 life is, all you did is now you're at 41 and your opponent is at 20. You don't actually accomplish anything. But if you cast 7 lightning bolts on your opponent, you kill them and they die and you win the game. So, and a lot needs to happen in order for this 7.5 to be worthwhile. So, yeah, the video game healing, unfun and bad. But bad, you can easily solve. You just say, okay, well, instead of 1d8, my Cure Wounds does 2d8. Now it's 9 plus 3. Now it's healing 12 on a turn. That's like substantially better, or maybe not substantially better, but that's at least on par with the like 8.5. At least it'd be an argument. But it being unfun, this doesn't solve. We're still dealing with the like filling up an empty bucket. So, but when we introduce like yo-yo healing, when you can heal someone at 0 HP and you are introducing another like combatant back onto your side of the field, you are now gaining that whole nother action every turn, and there is like a tangible like moment, like a moment you can like separate that you have performed this healing action and now the entire combat is different, and there's actually like a cathartic moment to like get that dopamine hit when you've accomplished your task of being the group's healer, and you've now like caused your team's damage output to go up by that whole other character. uh I've also realized that not playing the game is just really unfun. When you go down in a combat and you get, healed, but you're still stunned for 2 rounds, good chance that's going to be the whole rest of the combat. And sometimes when things are just moving slow and it's taking like 5-10 minutes for an entire like table round to get around, and it's like 20 plus minutes before you can even take a single action or do anything, uh, that's like the reason people stop playing D&D, because it's just like I just sat down at a table and did nothing for 30 minutes just watching other people playing a game. It just feels really bad. So I have learned to, in fact, try to implement the complete opposite and try to change death saves in such a way that you are always, like, at least gaining the option to do a thing. And yeah, so actually, I want people to be able to heal each other from 0 and get them back into the combat. And I want people to even conceivably still have the option to do stuff when they're at 0 HP. And so here's where my sort of like change comes into play. I've introduced like a new stat called strain. And strain by default 10 plus your strength mod. Add strength mod because it is such a underused, unloved stat in D&D. and this just gives it like a little bit of a reason to like consider choosing it over dexterity, and you gain a couple every couple of levels. Now, a strain check, every time you pass it, it's a low roll thing that you want. So a nat 1 is the best thing you can get, nat 20 is the worst thing you can get. I should say this is my second iteration of trying to implement this into my game. So it's still extremely inelegant, extremely clunky and cumbersome. But I do think ultimately, once I get it fine tuned, it will be, at least I hope, it will work better for my table than traditional exhaustion and death saves. So whenever you pass a strain check, you lower it by one. You can, on a short rest, recover 1d3, and on a long rest, you recover all of it back to your maximum. And strain, I have serve a double function as opposed to just being used for uh like the alternative to that 10 you have to roll against when making your death saves regularly. I also use this for like stunt actions in combat. I think like every DM at some point, or new player, or DM dealing with new players, has at some point had they got someone new into the game and they're telling them like, look, there's no, you're only restricted by what your character can do. Anything your guy can do, your cool barbarian guy can do, is what you have the option to do in this game. Like you can, so you can do whatever you want. There's ultimate freedom, and I think as like a new player, this sounds like amazing and awesome and a whole new world, like totally different from any other game you've ever played before in your life. And it's wild, and you want to do some wild things with it. And eventually you get into a combat, and there's eight goblins all around you, each with their knives pointing towards you. And you say, like, okay, cool. So I want to like take my sword, swing it all around me, hit all these goblins, chop off all their heads. Like, what do I roll? How do I do that? And then the DM sort of comes over and sheepishly, is like, oh, well, actually, first you would need a power attack, and then you need cleave. And then once you have cleave, then you can take great cleave, and then you can do that. So, maybe once you reach like level 8 or so, then you can maybe get closer to being able to do that. And that's just, it feels like an utter betrayal to hear that when you're just like, yep, yeah. So actually, you can choose one of these guys and attack him. And like when the first time you hear this, you think, it's like hearing Santa Claus is make believe. There's like a element of magic that is just ripped out from the world, and you're like, you just told me I could do whatever I want, and now you're telling me this is a board game, this is a video game. I pick my enemy and attack him. You're telling me it is physically impossible for me to take my sword and swing it around. Like, I get it would be a low chance of happening. I get it would be a really hard roll, but like, there's not even an option for me to do that. And that's where my like using strain to perform stunts comes in. So, like in this instance, you would make a strain check in addition to your attack check. And if you succeeded your strain check, then you would sort of gain the effects of having like great cleave as a feat for the turn, for example. And and with strain being both reduced over time, one, I feel like that sort of helps with like the spotlight sort of dealing outness over the course of a session. like the more and more crazy stunts someone tries to do, they will become less and less and less likely as the session goes on, which means like other people will get their chance to try to do stunts or whatever. I also like stunts. I wanted to try to capture a like in between D&D and like Warhammer Fantasy roleplay lethality in my game. Like I really like Warhammer Fantasy roleplay and the grittiness and the darkness of it. And but just like I don't want to play a charcoal burner. I don't want to play a dung collector. Like I get that's the whole point of the game is that you're just some dude in this world with orcs and goblins, and like a single goblin is like a terrifying encounter. But I still, I want to capture that sort of type of world that you live in, but we're following like the heroes of that world rather than the schmucks, the guys that eventually end up becoming 100-point characters that you have to take in, the battle game. And I also wanted to get capture that sort of idea that the real daredevils, like the people that are out trying wild stunts and trying to do crazy things, they exist. They're out here in the world and in the game. But these are the people that end up dying. And like the people that play things very safe and calculated and smart, those are the people that stay alive longer. And the fact that you lose your strain when you do absolutely wild things, but that strain is necessary to survive when you go down, I think will get people to think twice whether or not they want to do straining activities, these stunts. Which I think, like in regular D&D, some people would like refer to as like the rule of cool or what have you. So this is sort of my like attempt at like a fair way of implementing the rule of cool. And and yeah. So I've got my like death saves rules all here. They're pretty much identical to 5e rules. Um, except for okay, here's the first difference. So when you have a greater number of fails than your passes, you are unconscious. So pretty much the same as you would be in 5e. When you have a number of passes greater than or equal to the number of fails, however, you are simply, I've called it downed because I couldn't think of like a better word for it. And that's the sort of like video gamey term. I think like Payday, Left 4 Dead, any of those cooperative FPS games where you go in black and white mode when you're on your last life and you can like run around and shoot people on the ground. That's what I have for like down. So while you're downed, you can crawl, you can perform actions, but they're all made with disadvantage. And another thing is that when you are stabilized, this might be since like you can't be stabilized and then like that doesn't return you to 1 HP. That just simply means you stop bleeding out. If you're not already downed, or if you are downed and stabilized, that just means you remain in being downed until you receive proper healing. Uh, which I stole this entirely from a blog post, by the way, which I unfortunately do not remember the title of. And I like it definitely changed a lot of things here, but like this core sort of concept of being able to either be downed or unconscious instead of just always unconscious when you're down. Anyways, but they remarked that like this could lead to a sort of dramatic situation where you've got like one person left stabilized, but they're still like down, and they just have to like crawl all their way back like hours to safety. which I think it could be fun. I think it would be pretty grim and gritty for that to occur. No idea if that ever actually will happen in my game. 'Cause I feel like there's some other, not necessarily problems, but some other things that will occur with this system. Anyways, start of your turn, you make a strain check, which means when you go down the first turn, assuming you have like an around 10-ish strain, you're going to be either like unconscious or downed about 50% of the time. And if you go unconscious, then obviously someone else needs to help you. But if you are just simply conscious, then I will say this is just going to lead to everyone with any sort of capability of healing themselves to just always, heal themselves. And I feel like this is going to result in everyone just carrying around 12 potions of healing so that when they go down, they can just get themselves right back up. Which, on the one hand, I do feel like if you were in a world where potions of healings existed and you could literally cure your wounds and like restore your ability to fight in a combat just by chugging a monster energy drink, like everyone would be loaded with them. And okay, another thing I ever so slightly changed, the medicine chain or medicine check, I opted to just 12. Not a severely great difference, but 10 just felt a little too low for me. Yeah, you regain a hit point after 1d4 hours. I believe that's the same as 5e. And yeah, you return everything to 0, same as 5e. And basically, people can hit you when you are down at 0 to basically kill you. This is when people like originally remarked upon like yo-yo healing and it conceivably possibly being a problem. A lot of the solutions in the comments I found were just like, we'll just hit your players when they're down, which I feel like I do understand does make sense from smart evil bad guy's perspective if he has some understanding of like combat and how the rules are kind of reflected in the game and how he would do this back to the or like how he can use his sort of knowledge of that like against the players means that most of the time the smart evil guy is acting in the his best interest. He's just gonna start curb stomping the cleric and the wizard when they go down, which I feel like you know just feels kind of cruel. Like I like which and I know I just said I like the grim and gritty game, but it just I honestly I don't think I've ever had any character that has ever gotten curb stomped and killed in a 5e campaign. I can't think of that ever happening to me. I think I have actually done that to my players though in 5e, and it just feels supremely just like mean spirited, I would say. Like if the ultimate goal of this game is, to have fun, getting downed and then not having any way to get rescued or anything and just sitting in dread for 15 minutes while your character gets curb stomped into the dirt. It's like not necessarily not like evocative of an emotion you might want your players to feel, but I think I would like avoid it to the best of my ability. At least, you know, if waiting around for 30 minutes to take a turn is like probably the number one complaint I've heard from people as to like why they don't enjoy playing role playing games, then like just having your character get utterly demolished and having to sit there and wait as they slowly get stabbed to death by goblins while they bleed out on the ground. Like that must be like a close number two to why people would not have fun with D&D. And but with this ability to crawl, like when you get downed, now I can have like a plausible reason, a plausible excuse for why I would kill a downed player. Like if you get downed, but you want to still crawl up to the enemy and like stab him with your dagger or whatever, or if you are in any way make yourself appear to be a threat, then they are going to just curb stomp you and kill you. Which sometimes you might be willing to risk it. Sometimes it is just that utterly important that you specifically use this action to perform something necessary and cool and dramatic instead of just drinking a health potion. And when that happens, maybe you're willing to risk everything and get curb stomped and killed. Uh, but otherwise, you just appear to be like bleeding out and dying. And I feel like there is reason for these creatures to ignore you because you are literally in the like midst of death throes. And I suppose maybe if you're dealing with like an exclusively like melee combatant and there's no one else for them to like attack or defend themselves from, and they've got nothing else to do other than to just stab you, they might still just do that. But at least I think going down adds a little bit of like a reasoning for why someone is going to spend their turn to kill you when you're at zero rather than do anything else. At least I try to give people an out to just not have to give a logical reason why I'm not just curb stomping their characters to death. I am a huge fan of lingering injuries. And this, I know I just said all those nice things about yo-yo healing and why it's actually fun and not bad. And this is sort of my way of just ruining that entire argument because in my system, whenever you get reduced to 0 hit points, you suffer a lingering injury. Which means if you are constantly getting yo-yoed from 0 to 3 HP and then back down to 0, up to 3 HP, back down to 0, you are constantly going to be accruing lingering injuries. Also, additionally to these lingering injuries, the more and more you get injured and you're passing these strain checks to stay alive for your death saves, you are going to continue to lower and lower and lower your strain, which means you're going to get closer and closer to dying every time you go down. But at the very least, at least you're not going to have a -3 to everything for the rest of the session for going down 3 times. And I was also considering making this an optional strain check because sometimes if you are confident that you are going to get healed by like a teammate, then you might not even want to risk possibly lowering your strain if you think like, yeah, it doesn't even matter if I get any kind of failure. Like if I can just voluntarily choose to get a failure, then like, yeah, I'll just do that instead. But that kind of removes any way of getting a natural 20 in this instance, the high roll, and then gaining 2 fails. And also, I feel like this sort of just, if I included that, it would sort of add this sort of meta element of like players needing to now know oh, you got to know the death save meta. When you are at 1 fail and 2 passes, then you got to do this. And then which I kind of wanted to avoid that. Even though I did kind of like the idea of there being that sort of risk reward gamble. Do I trust my teammates to get us up? It also would have introduced a choice you could be making when you might otherwise exclusively just be making a death save roll. And but ultimately I decided against it. Lingering injuries. Yeah, I absolutely love these. Every time you go down to 0, you suffer a lingering injury. The most common of which, 15% of the time, you're going to be getting just a minor scar, which doesn't actually do anything. And most of the things near this value. So if we look at any dice, if you look at the average between a d20 and a d12, which is what you roll every time you go down in my system, you're gonna generally be getting like in a this range, 13 to 21. And these are all very like survivable. None of these are you're losing an arm or a leg or whatever. Like the default 5e lingering injuries table is like cruelly punishing. Like 5% of the time you're just losing an eye or losing a leg or something truly like awful. Whereas in this, like instant death, leg, hand, eye, like up to five, this like adds up all together to, like for like around 5%. Uh, if you take like all the bad things into account. And then on the other side, there's a couple of percentages. Mainly, what this means is you can like usually get away with suffering some lingering injuries more often than not. But if you like every time you go down to zero, if you start relying upon that yo-yo healing to bring you back up, you're going to start running a real risk of accidentally losing a leg or such. uh I also I love the Mordheim when you roll like the double sixes like as best as you possibly can on the injuries table in Mordheim. Your fighter, your hero is just like a complete badass and either like gets a scar or like I think he earns an XP is the main one. Is like battle hardened or something. And you get a bonus from becoming injured, which I get a real kick out of that. Right. One other thing that I did change is I did remove coming back to 1 HP on a best roll you can get. In this case, a nat 1. Now you just instantly get stabilized. Because the nat or you know the doing as best you can on the death saves was very dramatic, which I did like when it did occur. So I think there's an argument for keeping it, certainly. But I dislike, uh, maybe not necessarily. Well, I just feel like there's in this new system, there's already ways to get yourself back up. Like you already have the means to literally just heal yourself up from zero. So I feel like to have this additional way might just be like a bit much. I gotta sprinkle in that grime and grittiness and darkness somewhere in here. So, that's where I add that. Okay, so strain for stunts and okay, lingering injuries. Okay, I was considering, or actually at a time I was working on a separate chart for if you suffer fire damage and if you suffer psychic damage. And I got all the way through the fire one, halfway through the psychic one, and I started to realize, well, for one, it was just going to be a lot of work, and I was just starting to get really. I just came up with the options, not even the effects, and I was like, Jesus Christ, that took me forever. And I've realized that like most of the effects are honestly like kind of the same. Like a lot of these results would exist. I guess, if you're psychic damage, you're probably suffering something that's giving you a leading to madness to some degree or another. And fire damage, you might be more likely to receive like a nerve damage or something along those lines. Uh, but it would be like relatively similar results, just with altered chances and then also altered names. So my decision on that front is just to like tell people what the just to flavor the name of the injury depending on the damage type, but continuing to just use this chart. Like obviously, if you're suffering bludgeoning damage, then a crushed joint makes sense. If it's slashing, it's probably going to be lacerated, and or maybe piercing would be lacerated, and then slashing might be sliced, something along those lines. Like it would still have the same effect as having a crushed joint, but I would just call it a different thing depending on the damage type. Or you might suffer like a, I don't know, maybe not burned joint, like incinerated joint, maybe. And so yeah, I didn't bother with the new names. I don't think it's worth the. Also, if I did, I would have like instead of just one page of injuries I could read off of, I would have to make an entire booklet for like each different type of injury. Which I guess also I could just do like, okay, if you suffer fire damage, it's only a 1d6 table, something like that. I feel like that would probably lead to like different damage types having way too high of chances of doing something drastically, horrifically awful to your character, though. Whereas I want you to have to get pretty unlucky in order to suffer something like character ruiningly terrible. And right, talked about the recent the target down players, the voluntary fail and death saves. Yeah, I decided against that. And then potion sickness. So I was considering if players going down and just drinking potions constantly to keep themselves alive when they go down to zero, if that becomes a problem, I can introduce some sort of potion sickness, which in 5e they have like the mixing potions rule, which I think this would maybe I think that would be a borrow from that. I think that would be kind of fun. Alternatively, like could just be straight up Maple Story rules. You drink a potion and you can't gain the effects of that potion for a minute, or depending on the boss fight you're in that game. But in this, it would be depending on just the amount of time that has passed. So far, I haven't had any reason to implement any sort of like potion sickness or like any reason to try to keep my players away from like just spamming potions. So far, they've been relatively conservative with them, and uh, but I could see a universe where it starts to become a problem. Maybe like if once it really settles into them that they're like, wait a second, we should just all have a ton of potions on us all the time and just constantly be drinking them. But also potions just they start adding up. 50 gold each. Like, well, once you start getting to those really big treasure hoards, then maybe that'll stop mattering so much. But as long as you're still relatively early on, 50 gold every time you want to drink a potion is going to really add up. But I think that's everything I had. Maybe this can give someone else some ideas. This definitely still feels like I don't like, this whole like healing yourself system. May like it might just be too good. Like for a while, I was using all of these rules, but I didn't. I took out death saves for uh like my sort of own abstract version of death saves, where you either rolled one, two, or three dice just at the moment of you getting checked up on, and then depending on what kind of care you received at that time, determined how many dice you rolled and how likely you were to survive. That was kind of clunky uh, and kind of abstract. Honestly, it was less clunky actually. It was more streamlined, but it was very like abstract and like kind of gave you a reason to not check up on your friends depending on the circumstance, which just did not lend itself well to the verisimilitude I was going for. This new system, I do think probably more fun than classic D&D death saves. The fact that it is more complicated, it's not like you really have a lot else to try to like figure out when you're down anyways, when you're at zero. So I don't think the complexity really is any sort of a problem. I will say just my strain system in general, rolling two dice at once. If you like if you like pass on your skill check with like a nat 20, and then but you don't pass your strain check, that's probably a supreme feels bad. You're like, I just wasted this nat 20. I get sometimes you do just waste a nat 20. That be how it is. But I can't help but feel that like when that comes up, people are going to complain and say like, but I got it at 20. How come that doesn't change this at all? And then I have to be like, yeah, it doesn't. Which I do feel bad about because I feel like nat 20 that should mean something. Like nat 20 that should change it. But I can't think of any like it's gonna start if I say like, but if you get a nat 20, then the strain check is actually this. I feel like that if I started to do that, that would make a somewhat complicated rule, like even more complicated than I originally wanted it to be. But yeah, no, I believe that is all I had for this one. Hopefully, other people have got some ideas regarding this system and they can help me out, make it feel more smooth and like just entwined with gameplay seamlessly. Alrighty. Peace out.